Go.
Okay, good to go. Thank you. Thanks, Donna.
You're
And
welcome.
Thank you, Joyce, and thank you, Susan,
And Ann.
and Ann, and everybody. Yes, so let's begin. So from the earliest days, we know that there have been stories that people have told each other, not just for entertainment, but to try to make sense of the world. And we told each other stories about gods, kings and queens, and monsters and heroes, and battles, natural disasters. We certainly told each other stories, love stories, stories of envy and jealousy. And as soon as people could write, we wrote these stories down. And often the stories would follow a very specific type of formula. You know, think of, say, the Arthurian legends, the Knights of the Round Table. You know, the heroes had certain general characteristics in common, and the settings were romantic, the stories had a certain pattern. You know, you could pluck one character from one story and stick him into another without really upsetting the flow of the plot. So, however, as society evolved and people had more money, more free time, as a middle class started to arise, and here I'm really specifically talking 18th century England, writers broke free from this formula and storytelling started to change. And now I want to go down to the next, here we go. So uh, someone who noticed this was that fabulous, famous 18th century literary and social critic and commentator, Samuel Johnson, that man about town. He was one of the first to really document what he felt was the development of a new type of prose fiction that was different from romances. So he noticed that writers such as Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding were depicting characters who were distinctive, whose experiences and adventures were not too dissimilar to the scenes of everyday life, whose thinking and whose feelings evoked the reader's interest and sympathies as a result. So in a short phrase, two-word phrase, these authors seemed committed to capturing social realism of the times. Readers could see in these works life as they knew it. So let's read what Samuel Johnson said in The Rambler. The works of fiction with which the present generation seems more particularly delighted are such as exhibit life in its true state, diversified only by accidents that daily happen in the world and influenced by passions and qualities which are really to be found in conversing with mankind. So today we're going to talk about four 18th century English novelists, Richardson and Fielding, Francis Burney, and Ann Radcliffe. So virtually all scholars agree that Richardson and Fielding's works amongst the first English novels where social realism was really actively pursued. So we're going to start with these two folks. Now you notice the birth dates and the dates of their passing. Well, Francis Burney and Ann Radcliffe were a generation or two after these men, but they were pioneers too in their own rights. Their work, their fiction was sometimes experimental, and what was truly extraordinary, they were amongst the most highly paid authors of their time at a time when women were not supposed to be noticed. They were not supposed to call attention to themselves. And these ladies thrived and supported their families with their writings. So the plan here is we're going to do some short biographical sketches of each person. So I'll tell you about their lives, and then I'll tell you about one or two of their novels, and I'm going to do a little reading from a few of them. We'll start Richardson, we'll do Fielding, then Burney and Radcliffe. And if you don't know about these two women, you may have heard about Richardson and Fielding, but maybe not Burney and Radcliffe. I'm delighted to introduce them to you. So Samuel Richardson. Well, first of all, he came from very, very humble beginnings. He had very little formal education. His father was a cabinet maker, so he was in the trades. And he was apprenticed as a young boy to a printer. He learned the trade, he stuck to it, he was honest, diligent. He overcame great personal adversity He married and had 4 children, and his wife and all 4 of those children died. I don't know how you overcome that grief, but he did, married again and had another family. He became a master printer and he won lucrative government contracts. He prospered. He made a lot of money. He was moralistic, he was virtuous, and he made the transition to an author with his first novel, Pamela, which we actually know the date, November 6, 1740. He was 51 years of age when he wrote his first novel. And it was called Pamela, and here you can see the script. Pamela or Virtue Rewarded. I need to move my gallery because it's absolutely in my way and I cannot do it.
Here.
Hold on a second.
You can. Why isn't this working?
Yep.
Hold on.
I just need to move it. Just hold a second.
I know, but this is being erratic.
I can agree with you. Here we go. Thank you. Perfect. So Pamela or Virtue Rewarded. It was so successful, it's really hard to explain it. It was a phenomenon. In its first year alone, it went through 5 printings, all sold out, which continued for several years afterwards. It was translated into almost all the European languages. It became not only a fabulous book, it became a play, it became an opera. It actually became a waxwork so that people would go into into a room, life-size exhibits of the various characters in the book. And it was recommended from pulpits, and it made him a famous man. Just look at the frontispiece here. Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, in a series of familiar letters from a beautiful young damsel to her parents, now first published, in order to cultivate the principles of virtue and religion in the minds of youth of both sexes. Well, that might not do for today, but it was pretty hot in its time. So I want to tell you the story of Pamela and talk a little bit about it. So Pamela is a beautiful 15-year-old servant, and she's a favorite of the lady that she serves, whose name is Lady B. B as in boy. You know, it was the tradition at that time. You didn't name the lords or the ladies. You just put the first initial in and people could guess. So Lady B loves Pamela, educates her, and raises her like a lady, which puts her into a social strata that's between upstairs and downstairs, because Pamela's parents were poor. She's a servant. Now, Richard's style, as you can see in the frontispiece, in a series of familiar letters, that's called the epistolary style, meaning that the novel consists entirely of letters written to and from the novel's characters. So Richardson was able to use this method to show great dramatic intensity. Reading the book is like reading a play. And he was able to really capture the details of life as people knew them. He called it writing to the moment. He didn't invent the style, but he certainly did make it popular and used it wonderfully. It allowed him to put himself into the minds of the characters and the language of the different types of characters who would maybe speak a little differently without interference from a narrator. So his characters were complex, and the reader's relationship to them very deep. He really cared about these characters. He wanted to know what happened to them. So what do we learn in the very first letter that Pamela writes to her parents? But her lady has died. Lady B has died. And so now her world has changed. What's her social class? Now, this social class is a major theme of writers in the 18th and even into the 19th century. Class status, class conflict, class interactions. And as a result of the lady's death, well, Pamela is now in the employ of her lady's son, who is called Mr. B, Lord B. He's a rich man, and what he wants above everything else is to seduce Pamela. So the action is all about how she avoids the evil snares of this wicked man, this lord, who uses his power of position in every ploy to achieve his aim. So there's a scene in which he tries to rape her, but she talks him out of it, and she's rewarded in the end by reforming Mr. B and marrying him. And now she becomes the lady of the house. So you would think, okay, pretty traditional, story's over, but it's not. So the marriage actually occurs 2/3 of the way through the book. So you might think, okay, poor girl marries rich man, everybody lives happily ever after, social harmony is kind of preserved, this is all good. But Mr. B's relatives now arrive, and they think Pamela has duped Mr. B into marrying her. So they assume she has withheld her virginity and traded sex for marriage. And they really put her through the ringer. They are terrible to her. And it's only when they discover her journal and her letters that they can see what she's been through and they can understand her goodness and they accept her as part of the family. Now, it's a fun story, good story, but what made it so popular? Why did it hit such a nerve in that society? Well, there was nothing like it before. It was, when you look at it, it's an explosive story of class conflict, of an innocent girl versus her master, of tension across class lines. It's truly a scathing social critique of a master who's grasping, possessive, has no self-control, but he could possibly be made into a better person, capable of reform. Now, if Richardson had ended the book simply with the marriage of Pamela and Mr. B, then you would think, okay, this works out, poor girl marries rich man. But because of this family involvement, Richardson really acknowledges the difficulty of the social issues of the time, of all of this class conflict. It's not easy to change classes, and most people in England knew that. And so the social realism really came forward. And the attack on the aristocracy was very clear to people. So the story ends, however, with a final reaffirmation of social harmony and values. Virtue gets rewarded, but still you're left somehow with the feeling that the ending is unrealistic. Now, you can't get Pamela from our library, but you can get it on interlibrary loan. It's not too long, and it's really very readable. I'd recommend it. Now, his second book is Clarissa, the history of a young lady comprehending the most important concerns of private life, and particularly the distresses that may attend the misconduct both of parents and children in relation to marriage. So he writes this in 1748, and it is equally as popular as Pamela. He used the same style. It's an epistolary style, all letters to and from the different people. And it's a novel about Clarissa, who's a virtuous woman pursued by a libertine, whose name is Lovelace, Lovelace, which in the time would have been pronounced Loveless. And so this certainly sounds familiar, but Richardson really raises the ante. So just briefly, I'll tell you the story. Clarissa is a beautiful young woman, marriageable age. She wants to marry for love. The parents want her to marry for money. So she, in going to the various plays and operas, she comes across this man, Lovelace, who is this libertine, who wants to seduce her, but certainly doesn't want to marry her. But I don't know if any of you ever read Paradise Lost by Milton, but you know, the devil is the most interesting character in that epic poem. And in here, Lovelace is really the most interesting character. He's beautifully drawn. So the parents introduce Clarissa to the man they wanted to marry. He's not attractive to her. His manners are poor. They sit down to have tea together. He steps on her dress. Oh my God, he steps on her dress. He has a little flaky pastry crumb on his chin when they're having tea. I mean, she could not stand him. And as the marriage approached, she is persuaded to leave the house with Lovelace, become under her power. And he actually brings her to a secluded cottage where he drugs her and he rapes her. And as a result of the rape, she dies. So he has raised the ante here. on his attack on the aristocracy. While, the social affirmation in this novel doesn't come until the very end, when in the duel, Lovelace is actually killed. This is one of the few of a handful of 18th century novels that ends in tragedy, because most of them end comedically. So I want to bring you now, in contrast, Henry Richardson.
Henry Fielding.
Oh, I'm sorry. Every once in a while, I'm going to say Richardson when I mean Fielding. Henry Fielding was born a little bit later than Richardson, but the novels were all about the same time. And he's a terrific contrast. He is an in-your-face satirist, humorist. He spares nobody's feelings. He was the son of a freewheeling army officer. He was raised by his grandmother, who sought legal custody of Henry to protect him from his father after Fielding's mother died when he was 11. So the grandmother was quite wealthy. She sent him to Eton, where he had a superb classical education. He came from a wealthy family, unlike Richardson, who was a tradesman. He had superb classical education, a member in good standing of the upper crust of English society. So at Eton, he became a lifelong friend with William Pitt, who eventually became prime minister. So he traveled in high circles, but he was a wild young man. At age 18, he actually had to flee England in prosecution because he tried to kidnap his beautiful cousin, whose name is Sarah Andrews. Exactly why he wanted to kidnap her, I'm not sure. She was on her way to church, and one of the group of his friends tried to kidnap her, but it failed. And he had to leave the country. He went to the Netherlands, where he studied law for a couple of years. When he ran out of money and his family was able to smooth everything over, he came back to London. And he immediately gravitated to the theater, where people of ill repute actually kind of made their living. He gravitated to the theater. He became a humorist, a satirist playwright, a pamphleteer. He was a newspaper columnist. And finally, at age 34, he publishes a book called Shamala, which actually is more of a pamphlet than a novel. No one really recognizes it a novel. And a few years later, with the influence of his family, he was admitted to the bar. So as you can imagine, Fielding, was reacting to Pamela of having so much fame. There were people who were Pamela-ists, people who were anti-Pamela-ists, and he was definitely anti. He found the works too moralistic, too hypocritical, too preachy, and he took aim at Richardson's Pamela, whom he criticized as a hypocritical, crafty girl who understands the art of bringing her man to her lure. So now it could also be, I didn't mention Pamela's last name. Pamela's last name was Andrews. So whether or not Henry Fielding was upset about that because he tried to kidnap his cousin, Sarah Andrews, I'm not sure, but I don't know, that's quite a coincidence. So Fielding in 1741 writes his pamphlet called An Apology for the Life of Shamala Andrews. And here I'll read it to you, just the frontispiece. An apology for the life of Mrs. Shamala Andrews, in which the many notorious falsehoods and misrepresentations of a book called Pamela are exposed and refuted, and all the matchless arts of that young politician set in a true and just light, together with full account of all that passed between her and Parson Arthur Williams, whose character is represented in a manner something different from that which he bears in Pamela, the whole being exact copies of authentic papers delivered to the editor. So, and there's another joke. I mean, what a slam at Richardson this is, an outright slap in his face. And there's another kind of private joke here. He uses a pseudonym, Connie Khyber. Well, there was a playwright whom he always made fun of, whose name was Colley Cibber. So Connie Khyber and Colley Cibber sound an awful lot alike to me. So if that were enough, in the very next year, he writes Joseph Andrews in 1742. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this one. Uh, uh, this is unquestionably a novel, and certainly one of the first in English 18th century. And in the preface to it, Fielding actually identifies it as a novel, a work of fiction. He calls it a brand new type of writing. He calls it a comic, epic poem in prose. So here's the story. Joseph Andrews is Pamela's brother. And like his sister, he's in service to the family. And their name is Lord and Lady Booby, B-O-O-B-Y. So, and they're cousins to Pamela's Mr. B. So now we know Mr. B's real name is Booby. And like his sister, Joseph is virtuous. He wants to maintain his virginity until he marries his sweetheart, Fanny. And absolutely every woman in the book wants to try to seduce him. So I'm going to read you a few pages of this section. And so I want to just take a little quick drink of water. So the story is, he's in the service of Lord and Lady Booby. And just the way Pamela's book starts, Lord Booby dies. And now he's under the control of Lady Booby. And Lady Booby is very much attracted to him. Joseph has been in the service of their family since age 10. He's now age 17. She's made him her footman, so he's always with her, goes with her every place he goes. And then one morning, she calls him up to her bedroom about 6 weeks after Lord Booby has died. There's a wonderful illustration. We're going to get to that right now. Hold on one second. Here we go. It's a wonderful illustration that's in the book. And here's poor Joseph standing next to Lady Booby in her bedroom. And she says, you know, I really shouldn't have called you up here to my bedroom, but because I don't have any clothes on underneath this sheet. And here's some direct quotes. I'll do 3 slides from this. And Donnie, you have to help me move these pictures again. And what would you think, Joseph, if I admitted you to kiss me? Mm-hmm. Joseph replied, he'd sooner die than have any such thought. And yet, Joseph, returned she, ladies have admitted their footmen to such familiarities. And footmen, I confess to you, much less deserving them, fellows without half your charms, for such might almost excuse the crime. Tell me, Joseph, if I should admit you to such freedom, what would you think of me? Tell me freely. Well, madam, said Joseph, I should think your ladyship condescended a great deal below yourself. Phew, should see that I'm the answer to myself. But would you not insist on more? And what would you think, Joseph, if I admitted you to kiss me? Joseph replied, he'd sooner die than have such a thought. And yet, Joseph, she said, oh, I'm sorry, this is still the same page. I'm having trouble clicking, going down now. I want to advance to the next slide, Donna.
I don't know what, oh, let's try this.
Okay, okay, very good. And we move the pictures once again. Would not your inclinations be all on fire rather by such a favor? Madam, said Joseph, if they were, I hope I should be able to control them without suffering them to get the better of my virtue. ... Your virtue, said the lady, recovering after a silence of 2 minutes. I shall never survive it. Your virtue, intolerable confidence. I'm sorry. Donna, you just advanced the slide on me. We're having such trouble. Okay, have you the assurance to pretend that when a lady demean herself to throw aside the rules of decency in order to honor you with the highest favor in her power, your virtue should resist her inclinations? That when she had conquered her own virtue, she should find an obstruction in yours? Here Joseph really goes off the rails. Madam, said Joseph, I can't see why her having no virtue should be a reason against my having any. Or why, because I'm a man or because I'm poor, My virtue must be subservient to her pleasures. I am out of patience, cries the lady. Did ever mortal hear of a man's virtue? Did ever the greatest or the gravest men pretend to any of this kind? Will magistrates who punish lewdness, or parsons who preach against it, make any scruple of committing it? And can a boy, a stripling, have the confidence to talk of his virtue? Madam, said Joseph, and here he really hits Richardson again. Madam, said Joseph, that boy's the brother of Pamela, and would be ashamed that the chastity of his family, which is preserved in her, should be stained in him. If there are such men as your ladyship mentions, I'm sorry for it. And I wish they had an opportunity of reading over those letters which my father has sent of my sister Pamela's, nor do I doubt but such an example would amend them. Well, now that's quite an attack on poor Richardson. Then the novel goes on. Joseph and his Lady Booby at this point is so furious, she fires him, throws him out of the house. He determines he's going to go back to the hometown where he was raised, which is the manor home of Lady Booby, and he's going to go see Fanny. And so he departs. He's no sooner out of London, where he's beaten up by robbers. He's every penny he has is taken, and he's all his clothes are taken from him, and he's cast into a ditch. A stagecoach comes by, finds him, and brings him to an inn. Now, the novel is shared with Mr. Abraham Adams, who's the parson of the local town where Joseph Andrews grew up. And so they have adventures together. In addition, Fanny finds out that he's been beaten up, robbed, and is in an inn. So she leaves the manor home where she's a servant, and she goes to find him. So the three of them have all of these adventures on the road. The novel turns into a burlesque. If it was written actually by Groucho Marx, it couldn't have more crazy scenes in it. Here are some illustrations from one of the books. In the very first one, you can see that there's a fist fight in an inn with Abraham Adams knocking down the innkeeper and women fighting in the background. Then he gets doused in pig's blood. And then in the illustration on the bottom, he when he's on the roads, he gets dunked into a barrel of water. And then the people, another fight with kidnapping, trying to kidnap Fanny. It just gets wild and it gets crazy and it's hilariously funny. So there are also identity revelations, and there are gypsies and people who are switched at birth. So it turns out that Joseph's true love, Fanny, happens to be Pamela's sister, which is good because now she's a rich woman. But it's bad because now she's Joseph's sister, so they can't get married. Except we find out that Joseph was not raised by the Andrews. He's not Pamela's sister. He's the son of a rich gentleman. So at this point, you must be thinking this novel is absolutely crazy. And in a way, it certainly is. But despite all this fun, despite all this craziness, this novel appealed to the intellectuals of the day. Through the sheer mass of incidents and characters and human interactions, is burlesque, somehow the bell of social realism was rung. People could see through these complex interactions of contemporary society in scene after scene after scene, they could see social realism and they could see how people actually behaved, how lawyers behaved, how they talked to people, what their concerns were, how the sophisticated aristocrats behaved, which was bad. And so like Richardson, Fielding is actually attacking the aristocracy as self-serving and shallow, but he's doing it from a very different direction. So virtuous people win out and social harmony gets preserved because Joseph is able to marry his sweetheart, Fanny. So moving on, his next novel, Fielding, is The History of Tom Jones, a Foundling. You've probably heard of this. It's been made into a movie several times. It is his masterpiece. Once again, really hitting this theme of social realism. It's a satirical portrait of true to life contemporary manners, and has actually, it's his masterpiece because it is such carefully worked out plots, unlike Joseph Andrews. It has 4 volumes to it. It's actually in 18 books, so it's long, and it is racy, and it's hilarious. In many ways, if you think about Tom Jones as a character, he's the opposite of Pamela and Clarissa. Because in Richardson's works, these people were serious, moralistic, and through the use of his epistolary style, the letters, Richardson writes in the first person. Fielding, however, in Tom Jones, he's funny and he's bawdy, and he writes through the eyes of a narrator. The book is almost exclusively third person. In fact, each of the 18 books starts out with comments by the narrator. So Fielding is actually even talking about his theory of the novel in this book, in these sections at the beginning of each of the 18 books. And the reader's chief relationship is to the narrator and not even to the characters. So it's a little strange in that regards. You can get Tom Jones in our local library, and Joseph Andrews, they are there. So quickly, and I do mean this quickly, I'm going to tell you the story. Tom Jones is an orphan. He's a foundling. In fact, he is found as a brand newborn baby in the bed of Squire Allworthy. Funny name, Allworthy, and he's a great guy. He's Allworthy. But Tom, as he's growing up, always gets into trouble. He has very good intentions, but he lacks prudence, and he succumbs to many temptations. For instance, he was given a pony by Squire Allworthy, but he sells the pony, and he gets in trouble for selling the pony. But why did he sell the pony? Because there was a man on the estate who had just been fired, and he can't feed his family, he needs money. So Tom acts with the best of intentions. Now, he falls in love with Sophia, who's the daughter of a neighboring squire, but since he's an orphan, their marriage is forbidden. So he leaves home, and to seek his fortune, he's going to go to London. And on the way, he comes across a woman whom he rescues, who's in danger. She's being attacked by a soldier. She possibly is going to rape her. There's a lot that goes on of that sort in these books. He, as I said, he lacks prudence. They end up going to an inn, and he ends up sleeping with her. Now, what makes that scene worse, you know, there's the old story about find the worst thing you can do to your protagonist, do it, then make it worse, and then find out another thing you can do to make it worse than that. Well, what Fielding does in this case, so it was bad. Tom Jones sleeps with this lady. Well, Sophia has learned that he has left home, and she goes in search of him, much like in Joseph Andrews and Fanny. And Sophia stumbles across the inn, and she finds him in bed with this other woman. So that's a worse thing. Well, how can he make it even worse? Well, it turns out that the woman might be his mother. That's the worst. So, oh my gosh. However, by the end of the book, we find out that this lady is in fact not his true mother. We find out that his true mother is in fact Squire Allworthy's sister. So Tom is really not a poor boy. He's Squire Allworthy's nephew. He comes from the aristocracy. So now he can get married. So rich boy can marry rich girl. And he marries Sophia at the end of the book. So societal values are maintained, and following this rule that no matter what the protagonist does, no matter how bad it could be, as long as he reforms by the end of the book, everything is okay. So in his private life, Henry Fielding also challenged societal norms. He married a sweetheart named Charlotte Craddock in 1734, and she died 10 years later. And she was the model for both Sophia and Fanny. Within 3 years, he married Charlotte's maid, who was pregnant with Fielding's child. And so having a maid pregnant was really not unusual, I guess, but marrying her was, and this created quite a scandal, which he ignored. His influential friends appointed him London's chief magistrate in 1748, and he founded London's first police force, the Bow Street Runners, and reportedly a very hardworking, honest magistrate. So let's just talk a little bit about what we've learned so far and try to come up to a definition of what a novel is in the 18th century. So what generally defines this new literary form is that characters seem like real people, and there's a particularity to them. And we can learn about them, we can learn about their points of view, which are very specific. There's usually a uniform, plausible plot with the settings that are specified and detailed, and the action takes place in a particular time in a particular place. So they're unlike the, for instance, Arthurian legends that I referred to earlier, where everything quite seems the same. So, however, given that the story has to have a plot that's interesting, there is a sincere attempt at portraying life as people lived it. And in addition, because the authors were experimenting with different storytelling techniques and points of view, there was a chance to really see how the characters were thinking, feeling, developing, and with some instances, the narrator actually just disappearing into the background. Now, before I get on to talk about the ladies, Burney and Radcliffe, I want to talk about the major themes and concerns of 18th and 19th century novels and why these were the themes. So almost all of these books deal with social status and distinctions and how the classes interact with each other, how they get along. They're always interested in how people get ahead in the world. And they must always affirm the social order. Books at this time always were in support of morality. That was just deemed their responsibility. They wouldn't think otherwise. Almost all of the books in the 18th century dealt with courtship and love and marriage. And as I said, and we saw with Tom Jones, evidence where virtue is rewarded and vice is punished. Now, why would these be these concerns? There was a couple things going on in England at the time. By the middle of the 18th century, England was changing into the very first capitalist economy in the world. So the forces of urbanization, industrialization, globalization, those were all at work. The cities were growing. London by 1750 had 750,000 people. It was twice the size of Paris. In addition, the other major cities, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, they were expanding. So the growth of cities was actually unprecedented. It was unique in the world up until that time. Another key point here is that the rural economy was becoming centralized. So not only were cities changing, the country was changing. The rich were taking possession of the ancestral common lands. People who were poor would often be able to grow their vegetables, or they have a garden or a farm in certain areas, or graze their sheep or their cattle, while the rich took over that land, fenced it in, and became their land. The English belief in communal values and social obligation was really in question at this point. So in the countryside, it used to be the rich thought of themselves as having responsibility for the poor, but this was changing, and it really didn't exist in the cities at all. So people moving from the country to the city, they needed to make money. How people got ahead was very important. There was no social safety net. So now questions of how people relate to each other, that's just all in flux. Questions of cohesion, social responsibility, that was open game. So if you were an intellectual, if you were a thinker, if you were, in this case, not in our case, novelists, these were things that were on your mind, and this is what they wrote about. So although different authors would approach these questions in different ways, it'd be unthinkable for an 18th century writer not to affirm the social order, the moral good, and the reconciliation of class conflicts. Now, just to illustrate this point, Remember, Tom Jones, at the end of the book, Tom Jones is now rich, and he marries Sophia, who has always been rich. Here's the last paragraph. To conclude, as there are not to be found a worthier man and woman than this fond couple, so neither can any be imagined more happy. They preserve the purest and tenderest affection for each other, an affection daily increased and confirmed by mutual endearments and mutual esteem. Nor is their conduct towards their relations and friends less amiable than towards one another. And such is their condescension, their indulgence, and their beneficence to those below them, that there's not a neighbor, a tenant, or a servant who doth not most gratefully bless the day when Mr. Jones was married to his Sophia. So here you can see the author saying, so married man, married woman, they're terrific together. They show each other daily affection. They get along well. Not only that, they get along with their relations. They get along with their friends. Not only that, their condescension, indulgence, and beneficence to those below them. Neighbor, tenant, servant, kind of in that order, definitely in that order. They're equally as good to them. So social harmony was definitely on the minds of Fielding. So I just want to wrap up very, very quickly. Richardson, what's his major contribution? The first fully rounded characters in prose fiction, English prose fiction. He really went after moral conflicts in society very bravely. And his plots, very concentrated unity. These are not picaresque novels. They're not all over the countryside. And he brings dramatic tragedy into prose fiction. Okay. And in terms of Fielding, well, first to proclaim his work as a novel and adhere to social realism, a very convincing backdrop of many faceted society. He explains his theory of the novel, and he's just plain funny. So moving on to Frances Burney. She was a remarkable woman, very courageous, a novelist, a playwright, a diarist. She had a great talent for satirical caricature, and she lived a totally fascinating life. She was born in 1752 to Dr. Charles Burney, who was a noted musician and musicologist. Her mother was the daughter of a French immigrant. And so the family actually traveled in very influential, artistic, socially elite circles. She started writing at the age of 10. And in an age where it was thought improper for women to publish their writings, she wrote 4 novels, 8 plays, a biography of her father, and 25 volumes of journals and letters. Now, the novels were very well received, Evelina being the most popular. Her last 2 novels earned her so much money that she was able to support her family for the rest of her life on it. Extraordinarily well paid. The journals have been studied by scholars since 1889 for their insights into life at the time. So let me tell you a little bit. You can get this not actually at our library, but through Interlibrary Loan, her diary. At age 34, she was appointed Keeper of the Robes to the Queen, who was Queen Charlotte, and the king was King George III. She was personally friendly with the royal family. You may know, I'm not sure if you do, that King George III, who was the king during the American Revolution, had a blood disease, and he went insane for quite a period of time. He did recover from it, but they called in all their doctors at the time who had no idea what they were doing. He was very badly treated, strapped into chairs, a mask over his face. It was just horrible the way he was treated. So one day Frances was out walking in the garden because she was a member of the household and the royal garden, and under threat, nobody talks to the king. And she actually sees the king in the background, and he calls out her name. And she starts to run away from him because nobody is supposed to talk to him. And he chases her, and he gets very close and shouts, "Mrs. Burney, why are you running from me?" So she stopped. He gives her a huge hug, which is not like the King of England, gives her a kiss on the cheek, and they have just a remarkable conversation. He was starting to recover from his insanity. So this is nicely documented in their diary. It's very moving. Uh, what is the most, well, the most moving piece, I'm sure, she had a mastectomy while she was living in France with no anesthesia. And she records all the details. This is unique. There is nothing else really like this at all. She talks about how she did not want to be restrained. She's laying on the bed. They put a kerchief over her face, but you could see through it. And then she talks about seeing the flashing of the knives. And, it's just horrendous. It took her 6 months after the mastectomy to write about it. And she said she couldn't go back and even reread her notes at all. She also was present at the Battle of Waterloo, and she documented that, which was used by Thackeray in Vanity Fair as his description for that battle. So the sketches are really wonderful. You know, if you do get this, you can just dip in and dip out of it as you wish. But I'd like to briefly tell you the story of Evelina, the history of a young lady's entrance into the world. This is her most popular book. It's written in an epistolary style like Pamela and Clarissa, which were written 30 years before. The style was still popular, and she made brilliant use of it. It's the story of a young woman. You can see the frontispiece, Evelina, or the history of a young lady's entrance into the world. So she's moving into the society for the first time. Her father was a nobleman, and he deserted his wife, claimed the marriage never happened, refused to recognize Evelina as his daughter. She's brought up by a kindly guardian in the country. At 17, she's introduced to London by a grandmother and relatives who finally learn of her existence. But the relatives are all boorish social climbers, and they seem to drag Evelina down, who seems to belong with finer people. And she's just horrified at her relatives. And as she enters society, goes to the plays, goes to the operas, she attracts the attention of a variety of men, good and bad. And she's put into several terribly embarrassing situations, but very funny, including one where she's rescued by London prostitutes, and she's discovered in their company by a man she admires, Lord Orville. Well, as you would have to presume, it's a comedic ending. It all works out in the end. Her father recognizes her, which affirms her role in the aristocracy, and she marries a very nice man, Lord Orville, and lives happily ever after. So why is this so popular? Why was this a phenomenon? I mean, it's an old plot, right? An unacknowledged person to quality, finally recognized, marries rich, lives happily. Well, the richness here is that Burney's stated aim in her breakthrough contribution was, and this is a quote from the preface, to show the world not what it actually is, but what it appears to be to a young girl of 17 who's first entering society. So Evelina's all wide-eyed and ecstasies at the ball. She becomes interested in the man. She describes the extremes of excellence. She's horribly, comically embarrassed at the conduct of her relatives. In a way, she's like a teenager who walks 10 steps in back of her parents at the mall because she just can't bear to be seen with them. So Burney really gets into the mind of this young girl, and she gives an excellent depiction of high society life of the era, and considered by many as the creator of the novel of manners. And in fact, in the preface to Evelina, she says that her intent is to write about the manners of society. She was very much admired by Jane Austen, who took the title Pride and Prejudice from Cecilia, which is Burney's second novel. Very briefly, again, I'm going to talk about her last book, The Wanderer or Female Difficulties. In this book, Burney, her last book, she writes about a woman who has to escape the reign of terror in Paris, which Burney knew about firsthand. Actually, I'm going to qualify that. She didn't know about it firsthand. She knew about it because her husband actually had to escape Paris. He was a general in the French army. So however, the novel starts with the woman having to escape the reign of terror, gets to England. She's a high-class woman. She has no money. She's trying to make her living. She offers to teach music lessons. People send her pupils, the aristocracy send her pupils, but they won't pay her any money. And then her life goes down and down and down to lesser and lesser occupations. She's a milliner. She's trying to do everything she can to survive, and having great difficulty with social classes and with the norms of the day. This novel was panned so terribly by critics. She was paid a great deal of money on the basis of her previous third books. She was paid £1,500, which was an enormous amount of money. But it didn't sell. And the critics panned it because they could not deal with this issue of a woman having difficulties in the English society. In fact, one critic said there are no female difficulties except of their own making. So I'd like to bring that up because this is one of her major contributions. She identified the struggle of women in a male-dominated society, and she portrayed the lives of aristocrats, their pretensions, their foibles. She was very brave, and she was really out there. Her female protagonists, unusual for the day, a role model for Jane Austen and for other female writers. In the diaries, she knew these people, and she could write about them firsthand. King George III, Queen Charlotte, who was the Princess Royal. She met Napoleon Bonaparte on several occasions, Samuel Johnson, etc. An extraordinary woman. There is a Burney Society. If you just Google her, Google Frances Burney, and you'll find the Burney Society, which is very popular in London and up into Montreal at McGill University. Now, I know I'm coming close to an hour. I may be getting beyond it. I'm sorry if I am. Ann Radcliffe, 1764 to 1825. Very, very popular writer, almost as highly paid as Burney. Her father, she comes from just an ordinary working class family. Her father managed a Wedgwood china shop in Bath. She was a shy only child. Little is known about her education, and presumably there wasn't much. So the family mixed with some distinguished people, but they didn't make any large impression on society. When she was 23, she married William Radcliffe, and he was the part owner and an editor of a newspaper. And he was often away from home. And the story goes that in order to occupy, they had no children. In order to occupy her time, she started writing stories. Now, there was a form of writing called the Gothic novel, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, that had been introduced maybe 20 years before she started to write her first book, published in 1789. So Anne did not invent the Gothic novel, but she was attracted to it, and she just had this natural talent for writing in this style. She was called, in fact, the greatest novelist of atmosphere of her times. So her books are all about ghosts, dramatic landscapes, mysterious castles, much put upon heroines who not only face down all the fears of dark passages and ghostly apparitions, but solve the mysteries, proving that there are reasonable natural explanations for all the supernatural phenomenon that terrifies everyone in the stories. She portrays her female characters as equal to male characters. She allows the females to dominate and eventually overtake powerful male villains and heroes. And she creates a new role for women in literature previously not available. So her first novel is The Castle of Athlin in Dunbayne. Now this is published 1789, set in rugged Scottish landscapes, which actually became typical of Radcliffe's books. Always rugged landscapes, which she described impeccably, which was extraordinary because she never left England until after she stopped writing. All of this was from her amazing imagination. And this book was all about complex clan feuds amongst the Scottish Highlands, romantic intrigues. And in this case, she was an influence for Sir Walter Scott, who came after her. So full of medieval castles, rugged landscapes. Her most popular is Mysteries of Udolpho, which is a romance. It's a Gothic romance. Once again, lengthy, detailed explanations of rugged landscapes in Spain and in the Pyrenees. And the characters, however, here are really very crisp, and they do stand out as individuals, and you do care about what's important to them. Now, the bad guys, I have recently read The Mysteries of Udolpho. The bad guys are kind of out of central casting, I thought, and the descriptions of the landscapes to me got a little tedious, and the language is a little flowery, but the novel, pardon me, moves right along, and she has to be recognized as the novel of suspense. There was no one writing like this woman at this time, or with that degree of skill. You know, we're fairly inured to mysteries and suspense and people coming out of the dark and scaring you, but wow, you know, this was new and she did it. So the Mysteries of Udolpho, the story's about a young woman, Emily St. Auberge, whose parents both die early in the book. She's put in care of her aunt, who foolishly marries an Italian count who claims to have lots of money, but he doesn't, and he's only interested in the aunt's money. So the Count takes both these women first to Venice, then to his castle, which is called Udolpho, in the Apennines, where he resorts to pillaging the neighborhood, terrorizing the women to make sure they sign over their property to him. So there are ghosts, secret passages, escapes, battles, attempted rapes, horrible nightmares, broken romances. But it all turns out well in the end. She shows mastery of suspense and terror, scenes of dread. What's interesting about Anne, and here's a couple of illustrations from the book, and you can see all the ghostly scenes. Yes, it's fun. What's extraordinary about Anne is that she kind of bridges the gap between what was the age of reason, which the society was just coming out of, going into the age of romanticism. Byron, Shelley, Keats, etc., poets, of course, but people who wrote about romantic things. So she's right there, just a little bit in advance of them. But she has popularized the Gothic novel, and she's a terrific influence to people like Jane Austen, who wrote Northanger Abbey as a kind of parody of Udolpho. She certainly influenced Mary Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft. So a woman of terrific contributions. So here we have all the four people that we talked about, Richardson and Fielding and Burney and Radcliffe, each one of them responding in their own ways to these issues that we talked about. Social status, distinction, class interactions, courtship, love, marriage, how people get ahead. They all affirmed social order because not only were these novelists committed to social realism, but it was just their responsibility to affirm the social order of the day. So I do have some references. I won't keep the screen on this because it's very boring, but if you want to talk about references, and we had talked about the great courses before. There's one by Timothy Spurgeon called The English Novel. I use that very heavily. It's wonderful. So I know I talk very fast and I certainly monopolize, but let's open it up and see if there are any questions.